Fishing?
There's nothing fishy about it. It doesn't even stink, I'll tell you that. First of all, my name is Tommy Zott, and I'm the owner of Detroit Nutrient Company. And I wanted to come out today and talk to everybody about the advantage of vermicompost. There's a lot of different soil conditioners, soil amendments, things that you read about. Some of it's hokum, some of it's been around for 100 years. You know, people have been using manure for nutrients for as long as farming goes back. And really at the bottom line of what everybody in this room, everybody at this conference does is you're a farmer. I started out when I was a kid growing potatoes up north and then moved on to a more profitable crop. But the fundamentals of it is growing, and it is science, and we just want to get the most out of our plants, which probably separates us from most other farmers. Most farmers, they have a big area to grow in that's outdoor, that they don't have to pay to heat, pay to light, pay to put CO2 in, and they have all year to mess around with it. We need to get that same crop out in about 3 months if we can. So we take a plant that is supposed to grow a year pretty much and speed it up. And in doing that, we cause a lot of stresses on those plants, and everybody in this room is familiar with the stresses and the dangers of those stresses as well. Obviously, when you stress your plant, you break down its resistance to disease. You break down its resistance to different aphids, different pest organisms, and things of that nature. So when you incorporate different things into your soil, different amendments, different teas, things like that, worm castings, you eliminate those stresses, you give your plant an easier life, which helps it fight off pest organisms and disease. At its most basic level, that's what soil does. You grow a plant, you have to know about soil, okay? I'm not a scientist, I sell vermicompost, so I'm not gonna go into a very in-depth biological scientific explanation here on exactly why things do because of, get into the math and everything else. I'm gonna basically outline why I recommend worm castings and vermicompost and different ways that you can use them in your application, which is, I'm assuming for everybody in this room, marijuana cultivation, right? The most important thing that we all look in is smell, because everybody here has got a million filters and a million different ways to keep the smell down, so the mailman doesn't know that you got to grow in your basement, or the UPS guy does. So vermicompost, even though it basically is poop, for those of you that don't know what vermicompost is, it's worm poop, it's worm manure. You say vermicast or vermicompost or worm castings because when you associate manure, you associate it with that smell. The smell of driving up on 65 or 131 and going by a field and you smell all that manure. Because of a worm's digestive system, vermicompost is odorless. So it's an odorless pest repellent and a soil amendment. It increases your microbial life within your soil as well. We're going to get into all that. I just wanted to make sure let you know that's why they call it vermicast or worm castings, is just to disassociate it with the smell. So it's an odorless amendment to your soil mix. It's also relatively cheap. See, it's pretty inexpensive to make because a worm eats 4 times, well, a Michigan red wiggler, they say, eats 4 times its weight every day, processes 4 times its weight. So if you multiply that by a few million red wigglers, you can pump out a lot of vermicompost. When you take the composted material that you enter into your worm cell or your worm bin, and when they process it through, it's 20 to 40 times higher in concentration for that microbial activity. So you get the benefits, and they sift out half of the material for you through their digestive process and give you what's important. Now, for those of you that don't know how, probably the number one question that I get with vermicompost is, how do you tell the worms where to poop? And that's a pretty simple, and to some of you that know about vermicompost, and this is just will be a reminder, some of you that don't know how it is, it's pretty simple. They use red wigglers because red wigglers burrow and they live in a very shallow soil. They have the ability to live in shallow soil. That's why you always hear red wigglers. It's not an industry standard. It's because they're shallow burrowing worms. And you can take them and they set them up in cells. Some farms use windrows, some farms use cells. And you take a cell full, we have Michigan peat moss that's full of Michigan red wigglers, and you put about an inch of bone meal and corn on top of that soil. And as it enters the soil, the worms digest it, and you get about an inch of worm casting humus that comes out of the bottom. And that humus is your pure worm casting. That has all the nitrogen in it, all the microbial life. And it's digested, that composted material that you could put in a bin behind your house and wait a lot longer for it to compost. But it takes that composted material, breaks it down for you, and cleans it out. It actually filters it out through the worm's digestive tract. So you don't have the cross contaminants from the compost. You know, some people have a compost bin behind their house or a compost pile, and it's got, you know, eggshells in it and cat turds and everything else. Where especially in the commercial vermicompost industry, what we try to do is set a standard of what we feed the worms, so I can tell you exactly what our worm has been fed, so you're going to be more knowledgeable as to what your vermicompost is going to consist of. Now at the Detroit Nutrient Company, we only, like I said, feed ours corn and bone meal. Some companies have different diets for, you know, different attributes. That's our specific diet. Okay. What I'd like to see out of vermicompost a little bit is that we get to an industry standard. The problem is, and the reason that vermicompost scares so many people off, is because everybody has heard the horror story about somebody that had some gnat or some form of, you know, disease or something that came in a bag of compost. Now, with my product and with your bigger bag products and your standardized products, you don't have that contamination because we know what's there. We know what we're selling you. We know what we're bagging you, know where it's been bagged, things like that. That's why it's important that you look into your worm casting. You can make your own vermicompost farm in your backyard. Some of the people here actually have talked to me today and told me that they've done it. So those people are familiar with how it's done. It's easy, it's time consuming, and you kind of have to have a lot of worms to make a decent amount of vermicompost, especially if you've got 72 plants to feed, you know. So that's why we do what we do. We go out and we found the best in the industry with the highest nitrogen level, and we try to put it in a bag, a consistent bag with a consistent quality. And that's really important. Whatever worm casting line you use, make sure you investigate them. Don't just buy anything off of a shelf, because you don't want that contamination. And I don't want that to be attached to vermicompost, because it just, quite frankly, makes us all look bad. So that's a little bit about what our company does with vermicompost, and a little bit about our company. Like I said, I'm not a scientist. I'm a marijuana smoker, and I have asthma, and so I have to be very careful about what I put into my marijuana, so I grow organically. And that's how.
Sorry, can I just ask you, with the corn that you're using, do you have to worry that it's got genetically modified corn?
You know, I've never had that question. I don't believe that's the case with the corn we use. I can't tell you with 100% certainty that it isn't, but I'm relatively sure that it's not. I'd have to look into it, and I will post the answer on my website, I promise to that. So as an organic farmer, I started looking for ways to maximize my yield through different organic methods, and the most basic method to do that was through soil amendments. Everybody in here, obviously, I'm guessing 90% of you grow in soil. You're not hydroponic growers. So you know that's the cornerstone of your plant. Between your seed or your clone and your soil, that's the bottom line. That's about as basic as it gets. So what can we put in that pot, that initial step that's going to help us through every additional step? What is one thing that you can add to your soil that isn't going to take away from any other beneficial that you add to your soil, isn't going to detract from, isn't going to have a bad interaction with, is all natural? It's worm castings. It's going to increase your yield. It's going to increase your plant vigor. It's going to help you, especially during your vegetation stage of your plant, which I'm going to get into a little bit more here in a minute. But because of that, because of a very small initial investment in your soil, it's just common sense. I don't have to stand here and sell you vermicompost, because if you have a computer and you've ever looked into vermicompost, it sells itself. Somebody tells you, hey, we got a bag of worm poop, it's going to increase your yield, it's going to increase your plant health, it's going to increase your vigor, it's going to improve your taste, it's just going to help you every step of the way, it's going to make your plants greener. If it could make your eyes blue, it would be perfect. Is the way I look at it. And that's one of the benefits of my job, is that I don't have to sell you something that a million other people aren't going to tell you he's right. You can, anything that I tell you here, you can go and ask any grower, any experienced grower, and they're going to tell you everything I said was 100% on point. Because all of this is very simple science. As growers, as farmers, as agriculturalists, as gardeners, whatever you want to wrap us up into, even as caregivers, as human beings, we've got a little bit of responsibility to the earth. I think that we do. And because this is an all-natural product, we're not screwing anything up. So there is no downside. We have a civic responsibility, a social responsibility, and this falls into all of those categories. And that's why we stick with our product, and that's why we know about our product. Okay. Now, I'm going to go over some names of vermicompost for you, because some people come to me with different things and they say, is this the same thing? A bunch of names: vermicompost, vermicast, black gold, worm castings, and worm poop. It's all the same thing. It's all vermicompost in some form or another. And that's what I'm going to refer to it as for the rest of this, is vermicompost as opposed to worm castings. Just because that's really what it is. It's the compost is done through the worm's digestive system. That's why it's vermicompost. Okay, we went over the diet of the worms as well, and we went over why we use Michigan red wigglers. The reason we use red wigglers is because they're shallow burrowing worms. Now, with worm castings, if you are an outdoor grower, and I know very few people maybe here are, but I deal with some outdoor growers, and if any of you ever want to go into outdoor growing, when you add worm castings to an outdoor garden, it's not a smell, but worms can sense the existence of other worms in the soil. So deeper burrowing night crawlers are actually attracted up to, they're drawn to the worm castings because they believe that other worms are already there. So it kind of sends out the bat signal, or the worm signal, if you will, for other worms to come up from the bottom, which help aerate your soil and helps your whole growing process, along with adding more vermicompost. It enriches your microbial activity outside as well, just like it does indoors. Indoors you're going to re-stimulate it with different growth nutrient lines, or you're going to stimulate it with different teas or molasses or sugar or whatever you add to it. But outdoors, it's also going to add to the existing microbial range in your outdoor soil, and it's going to build it. So next year when you go to replant there, you're going to have a better base if you're an outdoor grower. Everybody thinks that we don't sell a lot to outdoor growers, that this is only something you put in a pot. No, this is natural, and actually in the spring, a lot of outdoor growers, when they go to do their planting, in the bottom of their planting hole, will put at least a cup full of worm castings. Almost any outdoor grower that's worth their salt puts a cup of worm castings. I do it with my outdoor garden, on my tomatoes, on my cucumbers, my bell peppers, everything. I use worm casting on everything because I get a good deal on it. But you can tell. And you can tell. I'll tell you, even in my tomatoes, man, I grow tomatoes the size of a softball, because now you have the enriched microbial activity. You have the nutrients. You have long-term and short-term release nutrients as well. So you have, initially, when you add it to your soil, you can add it in a myriad of different ways, and I'll get into all of them. But in an outdoor application, let's say in a flower garden or in a rose garden, if you have an existing garden, you can just score up the top of your soil and take a cupful and spread it over the top of it. You can put up to a 1-inch top coat on the top of your soil. And as you water that soil, the nutrients from the worm castings will leach into the soil itself. And within 24 hours of a good rain or a good watering after you put it on there, you can walk out and see. I guarantee it. It's not a promise. It's not a try and see. I'm telling you, you will walk outside and see the difference in your plant's vigor. And when I say vigor, they stand a little taller. They walk a little taller. They're a little greener, a little bushier. You know, my stalks are that big around. I don't have to, when everybody else starts adding their stakes in way early because their plants are drooping over and falling apart, I don't have to, because I've got big, strong, vigorous plants because I've amended them and I've kept them healthy. You know, when you add the microbial life as well, and you add the nitrogen, and when you add the different other benefits that come with worm castings, they help to create the funguses, the phosphates, the things in the soil that help your plant process the food and help your plant build a resistance to not only pest organisms, to hard-bodied aphids. They help build them a resistance to frost because it makes the lining of the cell walls a little thicker. There's a heightened resistance to frost. I mean, that's what a beneficial and all-natural substance is. And I have people that come up to me on a pretty constant basis. I do a lot of selling in the city to a lot of people with urban farms and urban gardens. So people that are maybe new to growing, and they say, well, you know, can I use it with Miracle-Gro? Well, if you're using Miracle-Gro, I strongly suggest you use it because we're gonna help build your plant back up. We're gonna build in the soil what you're destroying. And even with the chemical lines, and I have nothing against chemical lines, but I do want to point this out. Some people think because it says all natural on the bag that it's only for organic growers, and that's not a fact. There is no way that this is going to take away from your plant. Vermicompost won't take away from your plant if you use a chemical line. It's an all benefit in vermicompost. What it does do if you use chemical lines later on down the line, some of the microbial life that's destroyed by the chemical lines, some of the nitrogen that gets eaten away by the chemical lines, it's actually resupplying that and rebuilding that inside your pot while your soil's living and breathing, and adding to your root strength and helping your roots maintain the nutrients that they want to keep, because your roots got to take it in and then they have to keep it in. Your roots aren't an open valve at the bottom. It's more of a cork, okay? When the nutrients go in, you don't want your plant to re-release it. What happens with a lot of chemical lines is they break down that corky kind of quality that roots have. And by replacing this microbial life, it rebuilds that cork and it keeps the good in and only lets the bad out. So that's another advantage to worm castings as well.
The would it help, like, with, not down here so much, but my parents are looking at, they have shorter growings. Using something like this, and that's one thing that they try to kind of start a lot of them, things like that. Would this be helpful in maybe getting more growth out of them before the season ends?
Without a doubt.
Could you
The reason being,
Could you paraphrase the question?
oh, okay. The UP has a shorter growing season than down here. Do they help in a shorter growing season? Pretty much paraphrase?
Yes.
Yes. And the reason for that being, there's a couple of different reasons. A, because of the improved resistance to frost, obviously. And B, because in the vegetation stage of a plant, you want to add more worm castings than you do in the flowering stages, because they really help the vegetation stage. Now, they're beneficial through vegetation and flowering stages, but you reduce the amount in the flowering stage. And I'm going to get into that in a second here. But how that relates to the answer to your question is, if you vegetate them and you get them more vigorous in the early stages of the plant, you kick it into overdrive. Like my tomatoes started a month and a half before my sister's did. So I cut a month and a half out of my growing season, by doing that. So yes, it would be beneficial in that environment. And also in that environment, because depending on what part of the UP in, there's a lot of rocky soil up there. It softens the soil. Worm castings.
Actually, their soil is, they're down off of a block towards the riverbank.
Oh,
So
so
they've
they-
got really rich, my grandmother was growing celery up there. I mean, just crazy stuff that you wouldn't expect for that environment.
Right.
And it was the soil that gave them that chance to do that. I just thought that maybe it might be something that, give them that extra boost. My father couldn't plant when he intended to, waited, had to wait 2 weeks or longer, and that is a huge difference of it.
Yeah, if you use worm castings, it'll help because, like I said, it kicks that booth. It gets the root growth going, and actually, I'm gonna walk into that right now. So that was a good segue. When you go into, like in a marijuana application, when you go to do your vegetation stage, there's a couple of different recommendations that I have as far as worm castings go, because the nitrogen is more important in the vegetation stage. So is the moisture retention, and so is the soil softening. See, worm casting is a worm casting hummus. It basically looks like black hummus, if you've ever eaten garlic hummus, but it's black, and it's held together by that sticky bond. It's like a silicone. That silicone holds moisture, and that moisture is what holds that worm casting together. That silicone holds moisture into your soil, so when you water your soil, it retains that moisture and keeps it close. And now if you have your worm castings close at the bottom of your planting hole, or you have it mixed thoroughly within your potting soil mix, when you have that worm casting there, that humus is now, where is it holding that moisture? Right on top of your root system. So you have an increased moisture retention where you want roots to grow. And anybody that's ever cloned a plant knows that you need moisture, especially when you're rooting.
Does that also have worm castings make like watering, less watering?
Yes.
It holds water longer.
Yes, it'll hold it. I can tell you this, from when I went to using worm castings, I added almost 24 hours longer in between waterings, because you can tell in your outdoor garden, you can tell in your tomato garden even, if you put worm castings down in your tomato garden, you have them tilled into your soil. When you water your soil in the morning, when you come out at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and everybody else's dirt is that light brown color, your dirt's still black, because that silicone type, that's holding that water right in there, and it's holding it nice and close to the bottom of your plant where you want your roots to grow. And that is going to give you a more vigorous root growth and a bigger root ball in the early stages of the plant. So nitrogen, as well as that increased moisture retention, is very important during the vegetation stage, that first 4 weeks, let's say, of a plant's life. You really want to increase, you really want that. Like, I recommend myself, I use about 40% worm castings in relation to like 60% of a ProMix HP or a high perlite potting soil. You know, I mix it about 60-40. I put a little bit, about an extra cup of fine ground perlite in there, because you do want that air pocket space. You don't want it, worm castings are dense. You want to break it up a little bit with that perlite, and if you use the high perlite mix, especially, you reduce how much extra perlite you have to add. But if if you add about 40% worm castings, you can see a definite improvement in your root development, and you'll see a shortened vegetation stage. So you'll go from like 4 weeks to get to 18 inches, or however, depending on what amendment line or what line you use. You're going to go from 4 weeks to maybe 3.5 weeks or 3 weeks. You'll see those plants will really start to take off, and they take off with a real, not to sound like a doting father or whatever, but they just really take off. Man, look at that thing. You walk out of the room and you go on the next day, and you don't get those stresses after you clone, where your plants turn that light yellow. You get it in the tip of your leaves and things like that. You won't see that because it doesn't have that stress, because it has the nitrogen right there. It has that microbial life. It has the water there that it needs. It has all the things that plant needs to take off, especially in that vegetation stage of the process. Worm castings add all those little things to reduce those stresses. And we all know what those stresses cause. You know, you don't want a hermaphrodite, you don't want to have disease, you don't want to end up with mites. All of those things, a lot of people fail to realize a lot of the problems that we have with mites and that we have with white powdery mildew is really stress related, because we're taking a plant that's supposed to take a year and doing it in 3 months. So the least amount of stress you have in that environment, the more beneficial it is to your plant. And what worm castings do, especially in the early stages of the plant, is help to reduce some of those stresses. So like I said, in about a 40% to a 60% ratio with that, another good vegetation mix that I can offer if you want to get a lot of air pocket space, and a lot of people swear by this for marijuana especially, is 30% perlite, 30% vermiculite, and 40% of our worm castings. If you do a 30-30-40 mix, if you mix that together and run that throughout your vegetation stage, it's really supposed to be just crazy, crazy excellent for your vegetation mix. So there's a couple of mixture ideas for you. Oh, I gotta check my. I don't want to blabber on here. I get too sidetracked on mixing ideas. And when you go into your flowering portion. Now what I do is, most people transplant, they go up a bucket size, usually, not too long before they flower. I up my bucket size when I'm still in vegetation. And the reason for that being is, I like to get that extra little bump extra, so they're not root locked when they go into vegetation. So when you're going into that vegetation stage, instead you reduce it from 40% to 60%. I'd try and cut that in half. I would take it down to a 20% mixture on the advanced bucket size in your next bucket up. So when you do that transplant, because at the tail end of the bloom, you still need nitrogen. A lot of people think that, well, we just don't need any more N at the end. Oh, you do. You just don't need as much. you got to have that N maintained, and the long end of that N will still be there from your vegetation soil, which is still in your roots. And so you can cut it back to about 20% in the flowering portion of when you go up your bucket size. And usually, you're going to throw a little dolomite or a little backmono or something in there, and that'll take up some of the space of that worm castings or some of those beneficials, just to kick your bloom in. However it is you do your bloom mix, everybody, I'm sure, has their own idea. All right, now, sorry, I got to get back to my cards here. Now, we went over that, yes, they are odorless, and, okay. Worm castings.
Are your worms unionized, and you pay them minimum wage?
They are. We haven't told the worms that it's a right to work state yet, so they're still union producers. Now, the one thing, the funny thing that you mentioned that, and here again, and I believe in this, and I'm gonna go off on a little bit of a tangent here. I believe that Michigan has the right to grow medical marijuana, and the reason I think that a lot of voters did it was because, well, they gave our jobs to other South American countries, so let's take their jobs. and they're going to build our cars, and we're going to grow their plants. That's how I see it. And along those lines, we are an all Michigan company. Our worms are from Michigan. Our castings are made on a Michigan worm farm by a guy that lives in Michigan and pays taxes in Michigan. Our bags are made in Sparta, Michigan, by a guy that lives in Michigan and pays taxes in Michigan. They're bagged in Flat Rock, Michigan, at Flat Rock bagging by a guy in Flat Rock that works his ass off and does a real good job. And I own it, and I live in the city of Detroit, and I'm a big activist.
What incremental sizes can you get them in? Is it all the same one?
I do right now, and I'll tell you why we did what we did. We went into when we got into worm castings, we went to make the best product we could for the cheapest price initially. And when we did that, we found that a lot of companies ran a 15-pound bag and a 30-pound bag of worm castings. We went with about a 25-pound bag. You can mix it almost perfectly with a 60-pound bale, and it comes out just about right. Everybody was going to use about 25 pounds, so we made one bag. That way I don't have a plethora of extra bags that I had to pay for that I got to run up in the prices. If you go to my website, I sell I sell 1 pound containers as well, only on the website. We haven't started bagging them yet, just because we wanted to get out there and get in at a good price. We really wanted to be just another good Michigan company. There's a lot of great Michigan companies that have been represented here. A lot of the speakers today are great Michigan people. So, and I mean, I believe in that. So that's what we do, and that is. It's funny that you would mention the union, but the truth is that we are in all Michigan. We're the home team.
Mr. Unionized.
I had a question on this, just growing outside in the container. Just growing outside in a container, how thick do you want to put the worm castings in the bottom?
Well, in the bottom, what I would say, so you have like a raised bed container, is what you're saying?
Yeah, I've never grown outside. I'm just considering the next year, and I was still going to go into a big pot.
Oh, if you were going to do a big pot, like, I don't know if you would you might mix your soil for the pot, or you would just...
Did you say it earlier talking about putting some in the bottom of your?
Yeah, if you put some in the bottom of your planting hole, what you do is, like, let's say if you have an outside container, you have your soil in the planting hole. When you go to dig it out, when you go to plant your seed, or if you're going to use a clone, or if you have one that you've already started inside, when you transfer it in the bottom of the planting hole, just put a couple cups full in the bottom of that planting hole, and it'll get the...
I was told you were talking about container at that point, but.
Yeah.
Yes, I see. Yeah, I can see you told that's where you draw the other worms in there.
Yeah. Oh, if the container is going to be there's no bottom on the container. Yeah. If you put them about an inch heavy on the bottom and score up the ground at the bottom of that container, and it'll bring those low burrowing worms from the bottom. Because what it is insects, they have a sense. Another thing about worm castings that some people don't know, worm castings are a natural pest repellent. Most people aren't aware of that. What they contain a substance that breaks down the exoskeleton of many hard-bodied aphids and pest organisms. Okay, that sounds like a whole lot of science. Now I'm going to tell you why that's important. Because insects, they don't have a sense of smell, but they can sense things that damage them in nature. It's just, it's part of their, however they work. Like I said, I'm not a scientist, but they can sense the presence of worm castings. Worm castings break down their exoskeleton, so they will naturally avoid it. You can see it in example. It's a little easier to see examples of it with teas. And I'm going to go into teas right now because I just got the 5-minute sign. So that's a good transition. You can see good examples of it with the teas. This month in MMMR, I wrote a grow tip section that goes over AAC teas, actively aerated compost teas. And if you take an actively aerated compost tea made of just worm castings, you know, there's all kinds of benefits you can add to any tea recipe. And if you go to my website, we're going to be posting a ton of tea recipes, especially over the next month. If you take a compost tea and you spray it in a pile of leaves, you'll see the reduced insects and the reduced pests in that pile of leaves. Because it's a substance called chitin, and it breaks down the exoskeleton of those hard-bodied aphids. So it is actually a natural pest repellent. So the same substance, the same things that draws those lower burrowing night crawlers into your soil and into your outdoor garden, that also is going to repel other pest organisms as well. So on that note, we'll kind of wrap it up. Just to kind of touch back on everything, you're gonna get you're basically getting a natural pest repellent, increased moisture retention, increased nitrogen, increased microbial activity, long and short-term nitrogen that has no side effect with anything else you're going to put in the pot. So for, let's say, $20 a bag or $19 a bag, you're going to do 12 plants with it, and you're building straight up from there. It's a good foundation for you to build your house in. I'm not saying that you cannot grow a marijuana plant without worm castings. I'm just saying that I wouldn't recommend it. That about sums it up. One of the things too, and I'd just like to go over this about the AACTs. If you get a chance, please check out that the AACT article. I kind of talked on a little too much about worm castings. I didn't get to go into it much. But when it comes to making teas, anybody that hasn't made it, no matter what growth line you use as well, even if you're not an organic grower, you can still make teas that still benefit your plants, okay? You want to use them, I mean, you kind of want to use them within 4 or 5 hours of when you take them out of that aerated tea environment. But when you make them, they do, what it does is it creates that microbial activity, that microbial atmosphere. It duplicates it in a liquid form, and you can put it on as a foliar spray, or you can add it, you can put it, mix it in with water, things like that. So for those of you that haven't tried making any tea yet, especially if you're avid growers, myself, I like to grow things. I like to grow anything. I like to grow tomatoes. I like to grow weed. I grow whatever, man. I'm pretty easygoing that way. It helps with my blood pressure. And part of that passion has moved into the tea making as well. And if you haven't looked into any teas, for those of you that haven't, check out our website and really look into it a little bit. Check it out, and you'll see the benefits that it has to offer your plant, and the benefits that it offers you, knowing that you can create and control the way your weed tastes. You can control, when we come out to things where they have a cannabis cup that they're going to give away, and you're testing, and you're being judged against other people. One of the things I look at, one of the biggest things I look at is taste. Because sometimes you can smoke a joint that gets you high, man. I could do cocaine too. It's not as pleasurable. You know what I mean? That will get me high. If I do something that is going to get me high and it's going to be an overall pleasurable experience, that's one of the benefits of making your own tea, is you have total control over that. So if you get a chance, please do check out our section that we have coming up on the teas. And I think in Traverse City, when I speak, I'm going to try and get more into the teas. I'll lay my time out a little bit better. And that's what I have to say about vermicompost. I hope it was informative. Thank you.
And real quickly, everybody, everybody in the grow class, if you,